Have you ever looked at your own child and quietly wondered, when did we become strangers? Or maybe you've stayed awake because your back hurt, your knees ached, and one question wouldn't leave your mind. If I stopped being useful tomorrow, would my family still need me? I never thought I would ask myself that question. My name is John Carter. I'm 71 years old, and until last spring, I believed my life had been a good one. My wife, Helen, and I spent 43 years together. We didn't have a perfect life, but we had a happy one. We worked hard, raised our son Daniel, and believed that love mattered more than money. Helen always said that the greatest gift parents leave behind isn't a house or a bank account. It's the memories their family carries forever. She believed that with all her heart, and so did I. A few days before she passed away, Helen asked me to sit beside her. She held my hand and smiled the same gentle smile I had fallen in love with many years earlier. "John," she whispered, "when the time comes, promise me you'll trust me, even if nothing makes sense." I laughed softly and told her she was speaking like one of the mystery novels she loved to read. She squeezed my hand a little tighter. "I'm serious," she said. "Don't lose faith in me." I promised her I wouldn't. At the time, I thought she was helping me prepare for life without her. I had no idea she was talking about something completely different. 1 week after we buried Helen, Daniel drove me to the lawyer's office. The ride was quiet. Neither of us knew what to say. When we arrived, the lawyer opened Helen's will and slowly began reading it. She had left small gifts to family members and donated money to the church she loved. Then he looked at Daniel. "Helen leaves her son the Los Angeles penthouse and the investment account connected to it." Daniel looked surprised, but I was happy for him. Helen had always wanted him to have a secure future. Then the lawyer reached into the folder, placed an old rusty key on the desk, and looked at me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "Helen has left you the old Carter family farm." I stared at the key without touching it. The farm had been empty for years. The roof leaked, the fences had fallen down, and everyone believed it was worth almost nothing. But Helen never made an important decision without a reason. As I picked up the key, one thought stayed with me. Why would the woman who knew me better than anyone leave me? The one place she hadn't talked about in years. The drive back to Daniel's house felt much longer than the drive to the lawyer's office. I kept turning the old key over in my hand, trying to understand why Helen had left me a place she hadn't mentioned in years. She was never careless. If she made a choice, there was always a reason behind it. I wanted to ask Daniel what he thought, but he seemed lost in his own thoughts. He barely spoke during the entire drive, and the silence between us felt heavier than ever before. When we reached the house, Daniel didn't get out right away. He rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Dad," he said quietly, "there's something Melissa and I need to talk to you about." I smiled, thinking he wanted to discuss the funeral or maybe share a memory about his mother. "Of course," I replied. Let's go inside. He nodded, but there was no smile on his face. Melissa was waiting in the kitchen with fresh coffee. She greeted me kindly, but I noticed she looked nervous too. We all sat down, yet nobody reached for their cup. Daniel looked at Melissa before turning back to me. "Dad," he began, "now that Mom's wishes have been carried out, maybe it's time for a few changes." I frowned. "What kind of changes?" He hesitated before answering. "The farm belongs to you now. We thought maybe you could move there." For a moment, I thought he was joking. "Daniel," I said gently, "that place has been empty for years. I don't even know if it has running water." He nodded. "I know it needs work, but it's still your home now." His words were calm, but they hit me harder than he could imagine. Helen had been gone for only a week, and already my place in this house seemed uncertain. I looked around the kitchen where we had celebrated birthdays, Christmas dinners, and so many happy moments. It no longer felt the same. I wasn't angry. I was simply trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. Then Melissa quietly asked, "Have you thought about when you might go?" That simple question told me something important. This wasn't an idea they had just come up with today. They had already talked about it. As I looked from my son to my daughter-in-law, I realized the hardest part of losing Helen might not be her absence. It might be discovering how different my own family had become. I did not answer right away. Instead, I picked up my coffee and stared out the kitchen window. The backyard looked exactly the same as it had the week before. The swing Helen loved was still hanging from the old oak tree, gently moving in the wind. Everything outside looked normal, yet nothing inside the house felt the same. I finally looked at Daniel and asked, "Is this really what you want?" He lowered his eyes before speaking. "Dad, it's not about what I want. We're just trying to do what's practical." Practical. That word stayed with me. After 43 years of building a family, I had somehow become a practical problem to solve. I slowly stood up and smiled, though it took every bit of strength I had. "I think I need some time alone," I said. Daniel offered to help, but I quietly shook my head and walked to the room where I had been staying since Helen became sick. As I closed the door behind me, the silence felt almost painful. Her favorite sweater was still hanging on the chair. Her reading glasses rested on the bedside table, exactly where she had left them. For a moment, I forgot everything Daniel had said. I simply sat on the edge of the bed and let myself miss her. After a while, I opened the closet and took out my old suitcase. I wasn't planning to leave that night, but something inside me said it was time to start packing. I folded a few shirts, placed some family pictures between my clothes, and reached for the framed photo of Helen and me, taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. As I lifted the frame, a small folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. I frowned. I had never seen it before. My hands began to shake as I picked it up. It wasn't just any piece of paper. It was one of Helen's small, handwritten notes. I recognized her neat handwriting the moment I unfolded it. There were only 5 words written across the page. "Trust me, one last time." My heart started beating faster. These were the same words she had whispered before she died. She had hidden this note where she knew I would eventually find it. That meant she had planned all of this long before she became sick. I looked toward the old key resting on the bedside table, then back at her note. For the first time since leaving the lawyer's office, I stopped asking why she had given me the farm. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. What was waiting for me there that Helen wanted me to discover on my own? I folded Helen's note and slipped it into my wallet. Somehow, having those 5 words close to me made me feel as if she were still walking beside me. I looked around the room one last time before closing my suitcase. There wasn't much I wanted to take. At my age, you learn that the things worth keeping aren't the expensive ones. They're the family photos, the old letters, and the memories attached to them. Before leaving the room, I picked up the rusty key from the table. It felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of the questions it carried. When I walked back into the living room, Daniel stood up. "Dad, you don't have to leave today," he said. His voice sounded sincere, but something about it felt too late. I gave him a small smile. "I think your mother wanted me to see that farm as soon as possible." Melissa quietly brought me a bag with sandwiches and a bottle of water. "For the drive. You'll need these," she said. I thanked her. Whatever had changed between us, I still believed neither of them wanted to hurt me. Sometimes people make painful choices because they believe they're doing the right thing. Daniel carried my suitcase to my old pickup truck. Before closing the tailgate, he looked at me and said, "Dad, call me when you get there. I just want to know you're safe." I nodded. "I will." For a moment, it felt like he wanted to say something else, but the words never came. We hugged briefly, and I climbed into the driver's seat. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Daniel and Melissa stood quietly in the driveway, watching until my truck disappeared around the corner. The trip to the farm took almost 3 hours. The farther I drove from the city, the more memories came back. Helen and I had spent our first years of marriage on that land. We dreamed of raising our children there. But work had taken us to the city before that dream could come true. As the sun began to set, I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the property. Tall trees covered both sides of the road, just as they had years ago. Finally, the old farmhouse came into view. It looked tired, but it was still standing. I parked the truck, stepped out, and looked at the front porch. My hand tightened around the rusty key. Taking a slow breath, I walked toward the front door, wondering if Helen's biggest secret was waiting on the other side, or if opening that door would only leave me with even more questions. For a few seconds, I simply stood there, looking at the farmhouse. Time had changed it, but it hadn't erased it. The white paint had almost disappeared. The porch rails leaned a little to one side, and vines had climbed halfway up the walls. Yet something didn't feel right. I had expected a place that had been forgotten for years. But this didn't look forgotten. The grass around the front steps had been cut recently. The flower beds were empty, but they weren't covered with weeds. Even the path leading to the porch looked cleaner than it should have. Someone had been here, and not very long ago. I slowly climbed the wooden steps. They creaked beneath my feet just as I remembered. My heart beat a little faster as I placed Helen's old key into the lock. I expected it to stick after all these years, but it turned so easily that I froze. It was almost as if someone had been using that lock. I gently pushed the door open, and the smell inside surprised me. I had prepared myself for dust, mold, and stale air. Instead, the house smelled of old wood and fresh pine. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean. Sunlight came through the front windows, lighting up the living room. A rocking chair stood beside the fireplace, exactly where Helen used to sit during winter evenings. The old curtains had been washed. The wooden floor had been swept. There was even a fresh blanket folded neatly over the back of the chair. I slowly walked through the room, running my hand across the dining table. There was hardly any dust. That was impossible. A house left empty for years should have looked completely different. Then I noticed something that made me stop. A small vase filled with fresh wild flowers sat in the middle of the table. Someone had picked them only a day or two earlier. My mind filled with questions. Had Helen hired someone to care for the place? If she had, why had she never told me? I called out softly, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the quiet house, but no one answered. I continued into the kitchen. The old refrigerator was gone, but the shelves were clean. A kettle rested on the stove, and beside it sat 2 coffee mugs. I touched one of them. It was cold, but it had been washed recently. Whoever had been here hadn't abandoned the house. They had simply stepped away. As I turned back toward the living room, my eyes fell on a small wooden table near the front window. Resting on it was a plain white envelope. My name was written across the front, in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. It was Helen's. My hands began to shake. She had been gone for a week, yet somehow it felt as though she was still speaking to me. I picked up the envelope and held it carefully, afraid to open it too quickly. Then I noticed something else written in the corner. "Please read this only after you are inside our home." For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope. My fingers trembled as I traced Helen's handwriting. I had seen those letters on birthday cards, grocery lists, and little notes she used to leave beside the coffee maker. Seeing them again made it feel as though she had never really left. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was only 1 page, but before I read the first word, I had to wipe the tears from my eyes. "My dear John, if you're reading this, then you trusted me, just like you promised. I know you're confused, and I know this farm probably feels like the last place you wanted to be. Please don't leave, no matter what you find here. There are answers waiting for you, but they won't come all at once. Be patient, and most importantly, don't judge Daniel too quickly. He doesn't know everything." I read those last words again. Don't judge Daniel too quickly. That surprised me more than anything else. After everything that had happened, I expected Helen to explain why she had left me the farm instead of the penthouse. Instead, she was asking me to protect my son from my own anger. That wasn't like Helen. She always believed every problem had 2 sides. even when one side was difficult to see. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. As I looked around the living room again, I noticed something I had missed before. On the fireplace was an old family picture of Helen, Daniel, and me. The frame looked freshly cleaned. Beside it sat Helen's favorite blue candle. I walked over and touched it. The wax was soft, as if it had been lit not long ago. Someone had been inside this house after Helen died. A strange feeling settled over me. The farmhouse no longer felt empty. It felt as though it was waiting for me. I slowly walked through the hallway, opening one room after another. The guest room was clean. The bathroom had fresh towels neatly folded on the shelf. Even the kitchen cupboards held canned food, coffee, and tea. None of it made sense. Helen had planned far more than I ever imagined. Just as I reached the back door, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow and steady, crunching across the gravel. I held my breath and looked through the window. An older man wearing a worn brown jacket was walking toward the house with a small basket in his hand. He stopped when he saw me, smiled kindly, and tipped his hat. Then he said something that made every question in my mind grow even bigger. "You must be John. Helen told me this day would come." For a moment, I did not know what to say. The man looked to be around my age, maybe a little older. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his weathered hands told me he had spent most of his life working outdoors. He wasn't dressed like a stranger who had wandered onto the property. He looked like someone who belonged there. I stepped onto the porch and asked, "You knew my wife?" He smiled warmly and nodded. "For many years." That answer only raised more questions. Helen and I rarely kept secrets from each other. Yet I had never heard her mention this man, even once. "My name is Samuel," he said, as he held out his hand. "Helen asked me to look after this place until you came." I shook his hand, still trying to understand. "She asked you, when?" Samuel looked toward the fields before answering. "Long before she became sick. She said one day, you'd need this farm more than anything else you owned." I stared at him in silence. Those words sounded exactly like Helen, but I still couldn't understand why she had planned all of this without telling me. Samuel held up the basket he had been carrying. "I brought you some fresh bread and vegetables from my garden. I figured you wouldn't have much food on your first day." I thanked him and invited him inside. As he looked around the house, he smiled proudly. I did my best to keep everything just the way Helen wanted it. My eyes moved slowly across the room. Suddenly, the clean floors, the fresh flowers, and the stocked kitchen all made sense. Samuel had been quietly keeping Helen's promise. Before leaving, he paused at the front door. "There's one room I haven't touched," he said softly. "Helen told me it belonged only to you." Then he pointed toward the end of the hallway. My heart began to race as I looked at the closed door. After Samuel left, the house became quiet again. I stood in the hallway, staring at the last closed door. Every other room had been cleaned and prepared, but somehow this one felt different. I reached for the handle, then stopped. Part of me wasn't ready to discover what Helen had left behind. I took a deep breath, slowly turned the handle, and pushed the door open. It was Helen's old sewing room. I hadn't seen it in almost 20 years. The sewing machine still stood beside the window, and the small wooden shelves were filled with neatly folded fabric. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. It felt as though she had simply stepped outside for a moment and would be back any minute. My eyes filled with tears. On the work table sat a small wooden box with another envelope resting on top. Once again, my name was written in Helen's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a short letter. "John, if you've reached this room, you're already asking the right questions. Please, don't rush. Every answer is waiting for you, but you must discover them in the order I planned. Trust your heart more than your eyes." I read those lines several times. Helen wasn't leading me to money. She was leading me to something much more important. As I placed the letter back inside the box, I noticed a tiny brass key lying underneath it. It was much smaller than the front door key, and attached to it was a faded tag that read, "The Barn." The sun was already setting as I walked toward the old red barn. I held the small brass key tightly in my hand, while Helen's words echoed in my mind. The barn looked older than the house. Some of its red paint had faded, and one window was cracked. But the large wooden doors were firmly closed. As I stepped closer, I noticed fresh tire marks in the dirt. Someone had driven here recently. That surprised me, because Samuel had never mentioned coming to the barn. The small key fit perfectly into the old lock. I slowly pushed the heavy doors open, expecting to see broken tools and years of dust. Instead, the inside was neat and well organized. Farming equipment had been covered with clean sheets. Shelves had been carefully arranged, and the floor had been swept. This place wasn't abandoned. It had been protected. As I walked deeper inside, my flashlight landed on a large wooden chest sitting against the back wall. It looked older than everything else around it. Resting on top was another envelope with only 3 words written across the front. "Not yet, John." I froze. Helen had expected me to find the chest, but she still didn't want me to open it. Then I heard a car engine outside. It wasn't Samuel. Someone else had just pulled into the farm, and for the first time since arriving, I wondered if I was truly alone. I quickly stepped behind one of the old wooden posts and listened. The sound of the engine stopped, and a car door slowly opened. My heart was beating faster than it had all day. Samuel had already left, so who else knew about this farm? I waited for a few seconds before carefully looking through. A small gap in the barn wall. A silver SUV was parked near the house. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Daniel. I walked out of the barn and saw my son standing beside his car. He looked surprised to see me. "Dad," he said, "I am glad you are all right." I looked at him for a moment before speaking. "I thought you wanted me to stay here." Daniel gave a small smile, but it did not last long. "I did, but after you left, I kept thinking about Mom's will. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made." We slowly walked toward the porch together. Daniel looked around the property with a puzzled expression. "This place looks much better than I expected," he said. "I thought it would be falling apart." I nodded. So did I. I did not tell him about Samuel or Helen's letters. Something inside me said it was too soon. Helen had asked me not to judge Daniel, but she had also asked me to be patient. I felt there was still something she wanted me to discover before sharing everything. As we stepped inside the house, Daniel stopped in the middle of the living room. His eyes moved across the clean furniture, the fresh flowers, and the family pictures. "Someone has been living here," he whispered. I looked at him and quietly replied, "No, someone has been taking care of it." Daniel turned toward me with a confused look. Before he could ask another question, there was a gentle knock at the front door. When I opened it, Samuel was standing there again. He looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "I was wondering when you would come," he said quietly. "Your mother asked me to give you something, too." Daniel's face changed at once. "Mom left something for me?" he asked. Samuel slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope with Daniel's name written across the front. Daniel stared at the envelope without touching it. His name was written in Helen's neat handwriting. I had seen that handwriting thousands of times, but seeing it again still made my heart heavy. Samuel held the envelope out and said, "Helen told me to give this to Daniel only after he came to the farm on his own. She said the time would be right when he started asking questions instead of looking for answers." Daniel slowly took the envelope. His hands were shaking. "Why would Mom leave me another letter?" he asked. Samuel gave a gentle smile. "Because she knew your first gift would make you happy, but this one would make you think." The three of us walked into the living room. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the old clock on the wall. Daniel looked at me as if asking for permission. I nodded. "Go ahead. Your mother wanted you to read it." He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. As his eyes moved across the page, the color slowly left his face. He stopped halfway through and read one sentence again. Then he quietly sat down without saying a word. "What did she write?" I finally asked. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. "She said the penthouse was never meant to be my reward. It was meant to be my test." The room became silent. He continued reading. "Mom wrote that money can make people believe they have everything, even when they are losing what matters most. She said, if I cared more about the penthouse than my own father, then I would lose something no amount of money could replace." I felt a lump in my throat. Those words sounded exactly like Helen. She never believed money made a person rich. She believed kindness did. Daniel folded the letter and looked down at the floor. "Dad, I do not know what to say." Before I could answer, Samuel quietly spoke. Helen was not finished. He pointed toward the last page, still resting in Daniel's hands. "There is one more message." Daniel slowly turned the page. His eyes grew wide as he read the final lines. Then he looked at me and whispered, "Dad, Mom wanted both of us to find something hidden on this farm. She wrote that we can only find it if we search together." For a few moments, nobody said a word. I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me. It had been a long time since we had stood together, without arguing or avoiding each other. Helen had somehow brought us back into the same room, even after she was gone. I still did not understand her plan, But one thing was becoming clear. She had never wanted this to become a fight over money. She wanted it to become a journey that only a father and son could finish together. Samuel walked to the fireplace and reached for an old framed picture of Helen. He carefully lifted it from the shelf and pressed on a small wooden panel behind it. I heard a soft click. A narrow drawer slowly slid out from inside the wall. My eyes widened. I had lived in this house for years and never knew it was there. Inside the drawer was a rolled-up map tied with a blue ribbon. I recognized the ribbon immediately. Helen used to wrap every birthday gift with the same color because she believed blue brought peace. Samuel handed the map to me without saying a word. I slowly opened it across the dining table. It was a hand-drawn map of the entire farm. There were circles, notes, and arrows written in Helen's handwriting. Most of the places were familiar, but one small mark near the back of the property caught my attention. It simply said, "The old oak tree." Daniel leaned closer. I nodded. "There was one when you were little. You used to climb it, even after your mother told you not to." A small smile appeared on Daniel's face. It was the first real smile I had seen from him in many days. Then Samuel pointed to one sentence written at the bottom of the map. "Do not dig for treasure. Dig for the truth." I read those words twice. Helen was warning us that whatever we were about to find was not simply about money. Just then, a loud clap of thunder shook the windows. The sky outside turned dark, and heavy rain began to fall. Samuel looked toward the back field with a worried face. "If we are going," he said quietly, "we should leave now." I looked at the map one more time. Somewhere beneath that old oak tree, Helen had hidden the next piece of a secret she had protected for years. The rain grew heavier as the three of us hurried toward the back field. The wind pushed against us, and the wet grass made every step harder. I held Helen's map tightly inside my jacket, making sure it stayed dry. Even after all these years, I still remembered the path leading to the old oak tree. When Daniel was a little boy, he spent hours climbing its branches while Helen sat nearby with a book. She always worried he would fall, but he never did. Standing there now, I realized how quickly time had passed. The little boy who once ran across these fields was now walking beside me as a grown man, and somehow we had forgotten how to walk together. After nearly 10 minutes, we reached the tree. It was even larger than I remembered. One side of its trunk had been struck by lightning years ago, leaving a deep scar in the bark. Samuel pointed toward the base of the tree. "This is where Helen told me to bring you," he said. I looked down and noticed a small flat stone resting against the roots. It looked ordinary at first, but when I brushed away the wet leaves, I saw a tiny letter carved into it. It was the letter H. Daniel knelt beside me and carefully moved the stone. Underneath, it was soft soil, as if someone had dug there before and covered it again. Samuel handed me a shovel that he had carried from the barn. I pushed it into the ground, wondering what Helen expected us to find. The soil was damp, making the work easier than I expected. After only a few minutes, the shovel struck something solid. All three of us froze. I knelt down and cleared away the remaining dirt with my hands. A small metal box slowly appeared beneath the ground. It was old, covered with rust, but still locked. My heart was pounding. Daniel looked at me and whispered, "Dad, do you think this is what Mom wanted us to find?" Before I could answer, I noticed something attached to the handle of the box. It was another folded note sealed inside a plastic cover to protect it from the rain. I carefully opened it and immediately recognized Helen's handwriting. "If you have found this box, then you are finally standing where our future truly began. But do not open it here. Take it back to the house. There is one last thing you must understand before you look inside." I looked at Daniel, then at the locked box resting between us. We had come this far, yet Helen was still asking us to wait. The hardest part was not digging up the box. The hardest part was trusting that she still knew exactly what she was doing. The walk back to the farmhouse felt much longer than the walk to the old oak tree. Daniel carried the metal box with both hands, holding it carefully as if it might break. I carried Helen's map inside my jacket, while Samuel walked a few steps behind us without saying a word. The rain had slowed, but my mind had not. Every answer Helen gave us seemed to create two more questions. She could have simply told me everything before she passed away. Yet she had chosen this path instead. Deep inside, I knew there had to be a reason. When we stepped inside the house, Samuel placed 3 towels on the kitchen table. We dried our clothes in silence. The locked box rested between us. It was no larger than an old toolbox, but somehow it felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. Daniel looked at me several times, as if hoping I would finally say, "Let us open it." Instead, I remembered Helen's note. She had asked us to wait one more time, after everything we had already discovered. I was not willing to ignore her last wishes. Samuel quietly walked to the bookshelf near the fireplace and reached behind a row of old photo albums. He pulled out a small leather journal and placed it beside the box. "Helen told me you would need this before the lock is opened," he said. I slowly picked it up. The cover was worn, and the pages had turned yellow with age. On the first page, written in Helen's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Our beginning." I opened the journal and found memories I had almost forgotten. There were stories about the first day we met, our tiny apartment after we were married, the nights when we had only enough money for one simple meal, and the dreams we shared while sitting on the porch of this very farm. As I turned each page, I realized Helen had written this journal over many years. It was not about money or property. It was about the life we had built together and the promises we had made before success, before comfort, and before life became busy ... Then one page caught my attention. It had been folded neatly. I opened it and found a short message written much later than the others. "John, if you are reading this, you have already found the box. Before you open it, ask Daniel one question. His answer will decide whether the time is right." I slowly closed the journal and looked across the table at my son. Daniel could see from my face that Helen had left us another instruction. The room became completely silent. I took a deep breath and asked, "Daniel, Daniel kept staring at the table. The silence lasted so long that I wondered if he had even heard my question. Finally, he took a slow breath and looked up at me. His eyes were full of regret. "No, Dad," he said quietly. "If I had known what it would do to us, I would have walked away from that apartment." Without thinking twice, his voice shook as he spoke. When the lawyer read Mom's will, all I saw was the penthouse. I never stopped to ask why she made that choice. I thought she was rewarding me. I never imagined she was trying to teach me something. I studied my son's face. For the first time in a long while, I did not see a man thinking about money or success. I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. Helen had always believed that people learned their biggest lessons after making their biggest mistakes. Perhaps this was the lesson she wanted Daniel to face. I slowly nodded. "Your mother always said, it is never too late to choose your family." Samuel smiled gently, but said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket and placed a small brass key beside the metal box. My eyes widened. "Where did that come from?" I asked. Samuel looked at me and replied, "Helen gave it to me 3 years ago. She told me to keep it safe until both of you were ready. She also told me I would know the right moment." He looked at Daniel before adding. Daniel picked up the key, but did not rush to unlock the box. My hands trembled as I placed the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. For a second, nobody moved. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside the box were old photographs, a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, and a thick envelope marked, "For John and Daniel." Beneath them rested a worn leather folder that looked much older than everything else. Before I touched it, I noticed another handwritten note lying on top, comma. "The papers underneath explain what this farm is worth, but their value is not the reason I brought you here. Read my letter first. If you understand that letter, nothing else inside this box will ever come between you again." I carefully picked up the envelope and looked at Daniel. Whatever Helen had written inside was something she wanted us to hear together. I broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and read the very first line. My heart nearly stopped. "John, there is one truth about our family that I have carried alone. For more than 30 years, my hands began to shake so badly that I had to place the letter on the table before I could continue." Daniel looked at me with concern. "Dad, are you all right?" I nodded, took a slow breath, and picked up the letter again. Helen's handwriting was as calm and beautiful as ever, almost as if she were sitting beside us instead of speaking from the past. "John, if you are reading this, then you and Daniel are together, exactly as I hoped. Before you read another word, remember this. Everything I did was to protect our family, not divide it. I never wanted either of you to feel punished. I wanted both of you to find your way back to each other." I paused for a moment. My eyes filled with tears. Even after her death, Helen was still trying to keep our family together. I continued reading. "For many years, I watched both of you grow farther apart. Neither of you noticed it because life became busy. John worked longer hours than ever before. Daniel built his career and chased success. Every year you loved each other just as much, but you spent less time showing it. I prayed that one day something would bring you back together before it was too late. Daniel quietly wiped his eyes. He did not try to hide his emotions anymore. I could see the guilt on his face. I felt it too. Helen was right. We had never stopped loving each other. We had simply stopped making time for each other. I turned to the next page. That is why I divided the inheritance the way I did. The penthouse was never the real gift, and the farm was never the burden it appeared to be. I knew John would search for the truth because he trusted me. I hoped Daniel would follow because he loved his father more than he loved any building or bank account. The room became completely silent. Samuel stood near the window, giving us the privacy Helen had wanted us to have. I looked at Daniel, and he slowly lowered his head. "Dad," he whispered. I almost failed her. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his shoulder. "No," I said softly. "You came here." Before either of us could say another word, I noticed one final page folded inside the letter. Across the top, Helen had written just 6 words. I slowly unfolded the page. I took a deep breath before turning to the final page. My hands were still shaking, but I knew there was no turning back. Daniel leaned closer, and Samuel quietly stepped toward the window, giving us space. Helen's handwriting was steady, as if she had written the letter with complete peace in her heart. "John, the truth I carried was never meant to hurt you." I stayed silent because I believed love was more important than the past. When Daniel was born, we had almost nothing. We were struggling to pay our bills, and every day felt uncertain. Then your father offered to sell this farm. You wanted to accept the money because you believed it would give our family a better life. I was the one who asked you to keep the farm. I always believed this land would one day become more valuable than money. Not because of what was buried here, but because of what it could bring back to our family. I stopped reading for a moment. Memories came rushing back. I remembered that conversation, but I had forgotten how strongly Helen had fought to keep the farm. At the time, I thought she was simply holding on to old memories. I never realized she was thinking about our future. I continued reading. "John, if you are holding this letter, then my plan worked. You and Daniel are sitting together again. That was always my greatest hope. The farm was never your inheritance. It was your meeting place. I knew you would never ask Daniel to come here, and I knew Daniel would never come unless something pulled him back. That is why I divided everything the way I did." Daniel quietly covered his face with his hands. I could hear him crying. He looked at me and whispered, "Dad, I spent so much time chasing success that I forgot the people who helped me reach it. I thought providing for my family was enough. I did not see how far I had drifted from you." I reached across the table and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Your mother saw what neither of us could see," I said softly. "She gave us one last chance." As I prepared to read the final paragraph, something slipped from inside the envelope and landed on the table. It was a folded property document with Helen's handwriting across the top. I slowly unfolded it. The first line made all three of us stare in complete silence. The farm that everyone believed was nearly worthless had been hiding a secret that Helen had known for years. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I looked down at the document again, making sure I had read it correctly. The first page was an official land survey, completed almost 6 years earlier. Helen had signed it, but I had never seen it before. According to the report, a new state highway was scheduled to pass less than 2 miles from our property. Because of that project, the value of the land had increased every year. The farm that everyone believed was falling apart was no longer worthless. It had become one of the most valuable pieces of land in the entire county. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. "Dad, Mom knew all of this?" he asked. I nodded as I turned to the next page. She knew. There was another note attached to the survey. "John, if you are reading this, then you already know the farm was never a burden. I could have told everyone about its value years ago, but I chose not to. Money has a way of changing people before they have the chance to show who they really are. I wanted Daniel to make his choices without knowing what this land was worth. Only then would I know what truly mattered to him." Daniel lowered his head. "She was right," he whispered. I never asked about the farm. I only looked at the penthouse. I reached across the table and gently squeezed his arm. "You came back," I said. "That matters more than the mistake." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Dad, I am ashamed of the way I acted. I should have been worried about you after Mom died. Instead, I was thinking about my own future. I cannot change what I did, but I want to change what happens next." Samuel smiled quietly from across the room. Helen always believed people should be judged by what they do after they realize they were wrong. Daniel stood and walked to the window. He looked across the fields that stretched toward the old oak tree. "I do not care what this land is worth anymore," he said. "If you decide to sell it, I will support you. If you decide to keep it, I will help you rebuild it. This time, the choice is yours." Before I could answer, I noticed another folded paper inside the leather folder. Unlike the others, it was sealed with blue wax. Across the front, Helen had written one simple sentence. "Please open this only after you have forgiven each other." I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me. Neither of us knew what was inside that final letter, but somehow we both knew it would be the last piece of Helen's plan. I picked up the envelope and held it carefully in my hands. For a few seconds, I could not bring myself to break the seal. Helen had asked us to forgive each other before reading her final message. I looked across the table at Daniel. His eyes were red from crying, and for the first time in many years, I saw no pride, no excuses, and no distance between us. I slowly stood, walked over to him, and wrapped my arms around my son. He hugged me tightly, just as he had when he was a little boy. Neither of us spoke. We did not need words. The silence said everything that had been missing between us for years. When we finally stepped back, Daniel wiped his eyes and gave me a small smile. "Dad, I am sorry," he said. "I cannot change the way I acted after Mom died, but I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel alone again." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "I am sorry, too," I replied. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped being more than your father. I forgot to be your friend. Your mother tried to remind both of us that family needs time, not just love." Samuel quietly nodded. "Helen would be smiling right now," he said. I returned to the table and carefully opened the final envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter and one folded document. I unfolded the letter first. "My two favorite men, if you are reading this together, then my greatest wish has already come true. I never cared which of you received the larger inheritance because I knew money would never make either of you truly happy. What I wanted was for you to find each other again. If this letter is open, then I know you did." Tears rolled down my face as I continued reading. "John, this farm was always your home. Daniel, one day it will become yours too, but only if you promise never to measure its value by dollars. Measure it by the memories you build here, the family dinners you share, and the grandchildren who will one day run through these fields. That is the only wealth that lasts." I carefully folded the letter and reached for the final document. It was the last paper Helen had left behind. As I opened it, I realized it was not another property record. It was a set of instructions that would reveal one final surprise. Hidden somewhere on the farm, Daniel looked at me with curiosity. "What did Mom leave us now?" I slowly smiled through my tears. "I think," I said softly, "our journey is not over yet." The three of us looked at the final document together. It was not a legal paper or a financial record. It was a simple, handwritten page with a rough sketch of the farm. Helen had marked one last location near the hill behind the old apple orchard. At the bottom, she had written, "This is where I want my family to begin again." I looked out the window toward the hill. For years, I had passed that spot without giving it a second thought. Now it seemed to be calling us. The next morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds. Daniel, Samuel, and I walked across the fields with the map in my hand. The air smelled fresh after the rain. And, for the first time since Helen passed away, I felt something I had not felt in days. It was not happiness. It was peace. When we reached the top of the hill, we found a small wooden bench facing the valley below. The bench looked new, but the words carved into the back made my heart stop. "For John, where every sunrise will remind you that love never leaves." I gently ran my hand across the carved letters. Daniel stood quietly beside me, unable to speak. Samuel smiled and said, "Helen came here often after she learned she was sick. She asked me to build this bench, but she made me promise never to tell you about it. She said, 'One day, this place would help you heal.'" I slowly sat down and looked across the land that had once seemed like nothing more than an old forgotten farm. Helen had been right. This place was never about money. It was never about land or property. It was about giving our family one place where we could always find each other again. Daniel sat beside me and quietly said, "Dad, if you will let me, I would like to bring my children here every summer. I want them to know where our family began." I want them to know the woman who gave us one last chance, even after she was gone. I smiled and placed my arm around his shoulder. Your mother would have loved that, I said. Months later, we decided not to sell the farm. Instead, we repaired the house together. Every weekend, Daniel drove out with Melissa and the children. The old porch was rebuilt. Fresh flowers bloomed beside the front steps again. Laughter returned to rooms that had been silent for years. The penthouse remained part of Daniel's life, but it was no longer the place our family treasured most. That old farmhouse became our true home. Sometimes I still sit on Helen's bench at sunrise with a cup of coffee in my hands. I talk to her as if she is sitting beside me, and somehow I always leave with a lighter heart. She gave us far more than an inheritance. She reminded us that houses can be bought, money can be earned, and success can come and go. But a family that chooses to forgive. If this story touched your heart, remember this one simple truth. The greatest inheritance you can leave your family is never measured in dollars. It is measured in the love they still feel long after you are gone. A few weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a peaceful routine. Every Saturday morning, Daniel arrived at the farm before sunrise. He no longer came because he felt guilty. He came because he wanted to be there. We repaired broken fences, painted the porch, and planted vegetables in the old garden Helen loved so much. Some days, we worked for hours without saying much. Yet, the silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar, like the quiet understanding that grows between people who no longer need to prove anything to each other. One afternoon, while we were cleaning the attic, Daniel found an old wooden chest covered with dust. "Dad," he called, "I do not think we have opened this." I climbed the narrow stairs and looked inside. The chest was filled with family albums, children's drawings, Christmas cards, and dozens of old photographs. We laughed as we looked through them. There was Daniel, covered in mud after trying to catch frogs. Another showed Helen teaching him how to ride a bicycle, while I ran behind them, hoping he would not fall. Every picture reminded us that our happiest moments had never depended on money. As I lifted the last photo album, I noticed another envelope tucked beneath it. My heart skipped a beat. Even after everything we had found, Helen had left one final surprise. The envelope was smaller than the others, and across the front she had written, "For the day you finally smile again." Daniel looked at me and quietly said, "Dad, Mom really knew us better than we knew ourselves." I smiled and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph of Helen standing on the front porch, smiling directly at the camera. Behind the picture, she had written a short message. "If you are reading this, then I know the house is full of laughter again. Do not spend the rest of your life missing me. Spend it enjoying the family we built together. Every smile you share will be my greatest memory." I held the photograph against my chest and looked around the attic. The house no longer felt like a place filled with secrets. It felt like a place filled with love. At that moment, I realized Helen had never been trying to lead us to hidden treasure. She had been leading us back to each other all along. As summer came to an end, the farm no longer looked like the forgotten place I had first unlocked with Helen's rusty key. Fresh white paint covered the old farmhouse. The porch had been rebuilt, and flowers lined the walkway just as Helen always imagined. Every weekend, the sound of laughter echoed across the fields. My grandchildren chased butterflies through the tall grass. Melissa filled the kitchen with the smell of homemade pie, and Daniel spent more time beside me than he had in the last 10 years combined. The farm had not only changed its appearance, it had changed our family. One quiet evening, after everyone had gone inside, Daniel and I sat together on the front porch. The sky was painted with shades of orange and gold as the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. After a long silence, Daniel looked at me and said, "Dad, there is something I have wanted to ask you." I turned toward him. "What is it?" He smiled softly before speaking. "Do you think Mom knew all of this would happen?" I looked across the fields, where Helen and I had once dreamed about growing old together. "I do not think she knew every detail," I replied, "but she knew our hearts. She trusted that love would bring us back if we gave it the chance." Daniel lowered his head and nodded. "I spent so many years trying to build the perfect life that I forgot the people I was building it for. I thought success meant owning beautiful things. Now I understand that success means having people who are happy to sit beside you, even in complete silence." Hearing those words filled me with peace. Helen had always believed people could change if they were willing to listen with an open heart. Before we went inside, I reached into my pocket and took out the old rusty key that had started everything. I placed it in Daniel's hand. He looked surprised. "Dad, this belongs to you." I smiled and gently closed his fingers around it. "No," I said. "It belongs to the person who understands what this house is really worth." Daniel looked at the key, then back at the farmhouse. Tears filled his eyes once again. "I promise you," he said quietly, "this family will never lose this place." As I looked toward Helen's bench on the hill, I felt the evening breeze brush across my face. For just a moment, it felt as though Helen was smiling at us one last time, knowing the greatest gift she had ever given us was never hidden inside a box or written in a will. It was the chance to become a family again. The seasons changed, but the promise we made to each other never did. Autumn covered the farm with shades of gold and red, and every weekend, the whole family gathered there without anyone needing an invitation. The children collected colorful leaves. Melissa baked Helen's favorite apple pie, and Daniel had made it a habit to arrive early every Saturday morning. One day, as we repaired the old wooden fence near the orchard, he looked at me and smiled. "Dad, I used to think I inherited the better gift. Now, I know Mom gave that gift to you." I rested my hammer on the fence and quietly laughed. "No, son," I replied. "She gave it to both of us." I simply opened the door first. Daniel looked across the fields for a long moment. "I finally understand why Mom never told us the truth. If she had explained everything while she was alive, I would have focused on the value of the land. I would have missed the lesson completely. I nodded. Your mother always believed that people remember lessons they discover for themselves. Later that afternoon, our grandchildren ran toward us, asking if they could plant another apple tree beside the old one. Danielle looked at me as if waiting for my answer. I smiled. That sounds like the perfect idea. Together, we dug a small hole beside the orchard. The children carefully placed the young tree into the ground, while Melissa covered its roots with fresh soil. When the work was finished, everyone stepped back to admire it. The little tree was fragile, but it carried the promise of many years to come. Daniel quietly said, "One day, these children will sit under this tree, just like I climbed the old oak tree when I was young, and they will hear stories about their grandmother," I replied. That evening, after everyone had gone inside, I walked alone to Helen's bench on the hill. The sunset painted the sky with the same warm colors she loved so much. I sat down, looked across the farm, and smiled. "I understand now," I whispered. For the first time since losing Helen, the pain in my heart no longer felt empty. It had become gratitude. She had trusted love to finish the work she could no longer do herself. As I stood to return to the house, I noticed the lights glowing through the farmhouse windows. I could hear my family's laughter drifting across the evening air. At that moment, I realized something Helen had known all along. A house becomes a home only when the people inside choose each other every single day. Winter arrived quietly, covering the farm with a blanket of snow. The fields looked peaceful, and the old farmhouse glowed with warm light every evening. Inside, the fireplace burned just as it had years ago when Helen and I were raising Daniel. The difference was that now the house was full again. Our grandchildren played on the living room floor. Melissa filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh soup, and Daniel sat beside me, asking questions about his childhood that he had never thought to ask before. It felt as though the years we had lost were slowly finding their way back to us. A few days before Christmas, Daniel walked into the living room carrying a small wooden box. "Dad," he said, "I have been working on something." He placed it on the table and gently opened the lid. Inside was the old rusty key Helen had left me, carefully mounted inside a glass frame. Beneath it was a small brass plate with a simple message: "The key that opened more than a door." I smiled as I looked at it. "This belongs here," Daniel said, not because it unlocked the farmhouse, but because it unlocked our family again. I could not speak for a moment. I simply nodded and placed my hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would have loved this," I finally said. That evening, after dinner, everyone gathered around the Christmas tree. Before opening the gifts, Daniel stood and cleared his throat. "I want to say something," he began. "This year, I almost lost something that no amount of money could ever replace. I forgot that success means nothing if you do not have people to share it with. Mom gave me a second chance, and Dad gave me the grace to accept it. I will spend the rest of my life being thankful for both." The room became quiet. Melissa reached for Daniel's hand, and the children looked at him with curious smiles. I felt tears in my eyes, but this time they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of peace. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted gently through the cold air. I looked toward the hill where Helen's bench stood beneath the moonlight. In my heart, I thanked her one last time. She had not left me an old farmhouse. She had not left Daniel a penthouse. She had left all of us something far greater. She left us the chance to remember that the richest families are not the ones with the most money, but the ones who never stop choosing each other.